Since it was introduced in the 1800s, standardized testing in Australian schools has attracted controversy and divided opinion. In this series, we examine its pros and cons, including appropriate uses for standardized tests and which students are disadvantaged by them. It is generally reported that rural students are up to 1.5 years behind their metropolitan peers in the National Assessment Program, Literacy and Numeracy, APLA, and Program for International Student Assessment, PISA, tests. They are also less likely to complete Year 12, and half as likely to go to university. However, there are two key problems with how these determinations are arrived at: firstly, cultural bias in tests, and secondly the problem of averages. Cultural bias: if you ask a teacher in a rural school about the gap in achievement in APLA, they tend to roll their eyes and say something like, such questions include a literacy task asking a student to write a recount of a day at the beach, when they haven't been to one, or a numeracy task using a train timetable, which they don't use. Accurate response would likely be that timetables are in the curriculum, therefore it is right to develop a test using them. However, the fact that timetables are in the curriculum doesn't mean the curriculum is fair. That is the underlying issue with standardized tests. They need a standard curriculum. We might want to benchmark students' literacy and numeracy, but to do that we need to ask questions, and questions are always embedded in culture. The question is, whose culture? The Australian curriculum has been criticised as being metrocentric, in line with teachers' comments about the tests having no bearing to the students' lives. While we tend to accept cultural differences for students of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent, and students from language backgrounds other than English, we often don't consider rural kids to be different. However, the international field of rural literacies has shown us that rural people use different literacy constructions. In spatial reasoning, a key numeracy skill, we know that rural people use different spatial dimensions when drawing maps, not like the city blocks common in APLA tests. If we continue to ignore these differences in the construction of standardized tests, we will continue to produce disadvantage for rural students. The problem of averages. To have a standard to compare results against in standardized testing, there first needs to be a standard. How this standard, an average achievement, is skewed in countries like Australia, where nearly 70% live in capital cities. They skew the data to their own norm, reinforcing the cultural relevance, or irrelevance, in the bush, of the tests and curriculum and making these standards seem normal and just. Typically, results are reported as metropolitan and then rural students, with achievement in one compared to the other. This approach, however, collapses a lot of difference and creates much of the problem. When we break down APLA by the geographic classifications used by the Australia Bureau of Statistics, major city, inner regional, outer regional, remote, very remote, and control for socio-economic background and indigenous status, we get something different.